I actually decided to try the first event in my home city. So I thought, well, if I'm going to be doing this on the road, let me see what it's like here in Orlando. And I went to a potluck. They had it at the downtown lake area that we have in Orlando, and everyone brought food from their different cultures. There were maybe 60 people who showed up, and everything from young 18-year-old girls from Germany to maybe a 65-year-old man from India and everything in between. It was so much fun. I just had a blast, and that really set me off on wanting to connect more with couchsurfers as I traveled. Today, we are talking about finding community on the road. Hi, my name is Nicole. Welcome to the Travel to Money podcast, where I'm joined by my co-host, Sue, on this series about world travel. So,
hi, everyone.
Hi, Sue. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing really well. As you can tell, it's in the lead up to Christmas. I know by the time people watch or hear this, it will be in the new year. But yeah, we're getting ready for the big festivities.
Yay, that's exciting. Now, I know Nigel is traveling. Will he be home for Christmas or?
Actually, no, he won't. So it will be solo Christmas in the van. I may go and visit with some family on actual Christmas Day. So Nigel works a 6-week rotating roster. He's actually doing 7 weeks away at the moment. So it's like a job share. So when he's working, the other guy is at home and then vice versa. So he's back to back, has a young family. So Nigel very kindly offered to stay an extra week so that Dan could be home for Christmas with his young children.
That's so sweet.
Which is really nice. So, I mean, Dan obviously is then going to work an extra week to make it up to Nigel, but yeah.
Yeah, that's really sweet of y'all to give that up for them. Well, we briefly touched on this in a previous episode, but both full-time travelers and expats can struggle with finding community on the road. I'm just wondering, what are some ways that you would recommend for listeners to find like-minded travelers and form friendships while they're on the road?
That's a really great question, and I found it's really interesting right now as we're speaking, just over the last few days. I've noticed a lot of people reaching out on Facebook groups, talking about being lonely, and perhaps it is because it's this time of the year and people are used to spending a lot of time with friends and family and celebrating, that when you're traveling and you're not around friends and family, it really kind of heightens that sense of not being at home. I think these days it's very different. When I first went traveling back in 1989, there was no internet and no social media, of course, but what I found was that everybody was traveling, all carried the same guidebook. It was called Let's Go Europe. And so because everybody had the same guidebook, we'd all stay at the same hostels, we'd all eat at the same restaurants, and we met a lot of other travelers, and we're all in the same situation, so we formed bonds really well. I think nowadays it's quite different. And I guess back then too, when you'd go out, you'd have to talk to people. What you see now is a lot of people go out and they sit and they're looking at their screens. So I think, that's a whole nother debate on mobile phones and social media and that sort of thing. But I think obviously they do have their place. And I know here in Australia, there's a big Facebook group called Van Life Australia. There's also a Van Life Europe, which I've joined because we are going to Europe in the middle of 2024 to start van life over there. And that is a way that a lot of people make connections and meet up with people. And Instagram. And I think putting yourself out there online can be really good. We've made some great friends online that we've then met up with in real life. But I think if you are traveling, just being open to talk to other travelers. Obviously, you want to talk to locals, but I have always found that it's easier to form friendships and start conversations with other travelers because they're kind of in the same boat as you, as it were.
That's very true. I think I only did one trip. It was in Croatia, and I went with a friend who booked our stays in hostels. And that was such an easy way to meet other people because everyone else there is traveling. There are these community rooms. I just had this picture of a hostel in my mind that was not a great one. And then I got there and I was like, this is incredible. It was so much fun. And it was really great because it just immediately puts you together with people. So I'd imagine there's forms of traveling, even if you're doing van life. Do you often park in places where there are other vans and so there's going to be other travelers? Is that pretty common as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. And, we see that all the time, that you'll get to a free camp or even a paid camp. We tend not to go to actual organised caravan parks that much. And I think most van lifers don't. That's more families or what we call grey nomads here in Australia, retirees that spend a long time in each place. But I think most travellers, most van lifers, we do tend to gravitate to the same sort of places, whether it's a camp that you're at for the night or a car park by the beach where you're hanging out during the day. You see a van and there's often this like, I wonder what their van's like. And it's often like, can we check out your van? And yeah, sure, and come and check out our van. So there's a lot of that in the van life community, having a look at each other's home on wheels. So yeah.
You have an interesting situation since Nigel's away sometimes, and then sometimes he's there. And I've done solo travel myself, where I traveled 4 or 5 months alone. And then I've also traveled for a little over half a year with one of my best friends. And I found that I actually interacted a lot more with other people when I was by myself. People were maybe more comfortable walking up and just talking to me because they knew I wasn't engaged in a conversation with someone else. Have you found the same thing when you're alone, that you meet more people, and when Nigel's there, more of your interaction is with him?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm really introverted, so believe it or not.
I'm surprised. Wait, what?
No, we both are.
Oh my goodness.
I know, it's quite funny. So I actually find it quite difficult to approach other people. But if people come and talk to me, I'm more than open to have a conversation and that sort of thing. So I do find that when I'm by myself, that people do tend to approach me a bit more. One of the things that I have found, though, being a solo female traveller, is that solo men are sometimes reluctant to come and approach you. I guess they don't want to be seen as being creepy. Men that are travelling with their female partner are a lot more, do tend to be a lot friendlier, or solo females. So maybe that's just something that I've come across, but yeah.
One of the things that I did, now that I'm thinking about it, I did meet more people when I was solo traveling, but I also made more of an effort when I was solo traveling. And I did some of that through the Couchsurfing app. Have you heard of that? I'm not sure
I've heard of it, but I've never done it.
There.
Yeah.
I didn't stay at any homes Couchsurfing, which is kind of the main thing that Couchsurfing revolves around, but rather I used it because they have something called meetups or events. So I went to an event in Paris, and I would I met up with a guy in Rome and another guy in Greece who would just show me around the city. It was
awesome.
So much fun. And it's usually a group of really like-minded people, and the people who are hosting or meeting up with you in their city are usually really passionate about their city and showing it to other people. And that was a really great way to meet people. I think some people get a little worried about the safety of things like that. And so I always say I'm a very risk tolerant person. But I think you always have to follow your gut also. Do things in safe public spaces and you're probably going to be okay. If something seems off, maybe it is off. So trust your gut. Make sure you meet up in safe spaces. But I do think there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of incredible people that I met through things like that.
I'm going to have to check that out. That sounds really cool. Yeah.
It's really neat. I think I went to a karaoke night in Paris. That's one of the things. I actually decided to try the first event in my home city. So I thought, well, if I'm going to be doing this on the road, let me see what it's like here in Orlando. And I went to a potluck. They had it at the downtown lake area that we have in Orlando, and everyone brought food from their different cultures. There were maybe 60 people who showed up, and everything from young 18-year-old girls from Germany to maybe a 65-year-old man from India, and everything in between. It was so much fun. I just had a blast, and that really set me off on wanting to connect more with couch surfers as I traveled. So there was definitely a lot of willingness there. But I think there were also times where I definitely struggled with loneliness on that first trip. I was kind of sick for a while, so First, I had some sort of crazy eye infection and I couldn't see out of one of my eyes for almost, it was like a couple of weeks, but it had my eye looking really weird for like a month. And you don't really want to meet people when your eye is like, I looked pretty crazy. Anyhow, and then I hurt my back when I got to Italy and I was just like out of sorts for a long time, but really struggling with loneliness. And I had a conversation with my boss and we got on the phone, and this was my first real adventure. And he said, you know, Nicole, it's okay to come home if you need to come home. And you also don't have to say, I'm coming home and I'm staying home. You don't have to make any huge decisions. If you need to come rest, get well, and go out again, do that. But like, give yourself the freedom to just be open to that. Don't feel like you need to make a decision about whether or not travel is good for you or not good for you. And so that was really helpful. It just it was really freeing. But I did decide to hop over to the UK because one of my best friends was traveling there just to see she and her daughter for 3 days. And that refreshed me and I jumped back into my traveling after that. But I do think loneliness is something that many travelers may run into, or just feeling isolated. What do you think are some ways that listeners can overcome feelings of loneliness or isolation while traveling, when they're solo especially?
I think that it's really a matter of putting yourself out there. And I know this is something that when I have traveled solo, I have really struggled with. After I went through my separation, I hadn't traveled overseas and done a big trip for at least 10 years. More like 12. I can't remember the exact amount of time, but there was a big part of me that was just like, I need to go and do a trip and I need to go by myself. And it was almost like it was my way of reclaiming myself, because travel had always been such a big part of my life before my marriage. And so I went to Cambodia. I think I went for like 2 weeks or something. The kids went to their father, and, you know, it was really huge for me to go and do this trip by myself. I was staying in hotels, not hostels, because I was kind of beyond the point of, you know, wanting to really rough it, I guess. I wanted to have a little bit of luxury. And it was tricky, you know, I was going out and sitting in restaurants and eating meals by myself. And I think for me, what I found was just being really open to talking to other people. I remember one day I hired a tuk-tuk driver to take me around for the day and just had the most incredible day with this local person. And he normally just sat and waited while his guest would go and do, you know, check out the site. But he ended up coming with me and we had a really good time. So another time I saw another girl sitting by herself, much younger than me, but at a cafe, and I just said, oh, do you mind if I sit here? You know, I think you really have to put yourself out there. And we had a good conversation. So, but look, it can be tricky, but also being open to other people approaching you as well. So not sitting there on your phone the whole time. I was going to say with your head in a book, but, you know, let's talk the 2024 version of with your head in a book, which is, you know, your mobile phone in your hand. Yeah, it's definitely, and I think just being aware that this is most likely going to be something that you will encounter if you are solo traveling, is that loneliness. The good news is, of course, we are so connected, so it's easy just to pick up that phone that you've put down and you can quickly have a video conversation with your loved ones back at home. And sometimes that can be enough to keep you going for a little bit longer.
Well, as you were talking about people coming up to you, I remembered one of my favorite encounters of all of my travels. It's probably the favorite. I was in Greece. It was my last day in Athens and I went to the beach and I'm laying on the beach on a towel. I think I was half asleep. People kept coming up to me offering massages for like $5 or something. And so had a few people like that. First, it was like an older woman with like a down coat on. And then there was like a man that walked out of the water in a Speedo that was like, I'll give you a massage for $5. Like, oh, okay, thank you.
No thanks.
Anyway, so I'm just laying there. I'm half asleep. And this guy walks up to me and he was like, I'm sorry, do you have any tweezers by any chance? And I was like, no, I'm sorry, I don't have any tweezers. And
How
he said,
random.
I got something stuck in my finger from in the sea. I was like, I'm really sorry, I don't. And he was like, okay. He was like, would you mind if I sat and talked to you for a bit? And I was like, sure, sit down, talk if you want. So it turns out that he was a refugee from Iraq, and he spoke American English about as well as most Americans. It wasn't like someone who had been trained to speak English. You know how if someone learns English as a second language, obviously it's more formal most of the time. And so his had a lot of like American slang and really comfortable conversation. One of the best English speakers I've met that learned English as a second language. So we get to talking, and he had this fascinating story. He had lost his whole family, which he didn't tell me initially, but just due to conflict in Iraq, and eventually made his way over. And he spoke somewhere between 7 and 10 different languages.
Wow.
It was incredible. And I said, how did you learn to speak all of these languages? And he said, you're not going to believe me. I learned from the television. And he was so funny, and would sit there and people would walk by and he would pretend like he was them talking, or he was hysterical. Hours went by. We sat there talking. Eventually, he told me about a Kurdish restaurant that was in the city center of Athens. And so we actually decided to go back to our respective apartments, change, and meet up again in the center to go for dinner. So he takes me out for dinner at this Kurdish restaurant. And it was after that where he really kind of started to open up and tell me more about his family and some of the very difficult circumstances he had come from. I have never heard someone tell a story like him. It was beautiful. And he's been through a lot of hard things, but it was also so encouraging to meet this person who was making the most of his life. Learning those languages was how he got out of the refugee camps. He worked his way out by being a translator and was really trying to make the most of his opportunities. But it was one of my favorite experiences. And if he had come up and I had said, oh, no, I'm good, I would have missed out on one of the most incredible opportunities. So I think you're right when it comes to just really being open to other people approaching you and not always being afraid. I feel like, especially as females, we have so much fear put in us about what to watch out for. But for the most part, I find that people are kind and
yeah, definitely.
You know, so that was one of my favorite experiences.
Just recently, actually, here in Australia, we were driving in the outback, and there'd been a lot of rain, and we were stopped by this very muddy patch, and we weren't really sure. Our van is a 4-wheel drive, 4x4, but we weren't really sure if we should drive through or not. And we decided to wait until someone else came through and we'd watch them go through, and then we could make up our mind. We were sitting there for over an hour waiting for another car. And anyway, long story short, when the people came through, it turned out they were scouts for a big group that was driving this road in the same direction we were. They'd gone on ahead to scope out the road conditions and were coming back. And their group they were doing a charity walk from the centre of Australia, the geographic centre, to Parliament House in Canberra, which is, I don't know, it's over 1,000 miles anyway. It's a long way. It took them 3 months to do this walk. They were first responders, so they were police and fire and army, and they were doing this charity walk to raise awareness for the mental health issues that first responders face. Some of the most interesting people we've ever met. So they basically adopted us this day, and they said, don't worry, we're going to help you get through. We'll stick with you the whole rest of the way to where we're going, which they did. And, you know, obviously people that are going to go into that line of work are going to be very caring and always want to make sure everybody's safe. And we just felt so welcomed into their little tribe. And they were right near the beginning of their walk. So the next day we said, can we do part of the walk with you? And they're like, yeah, you know, they were near the beginning of their walk, so they hadn't had other people join them before. So we joined them on the walk the next day, and oh my gosh, you know, and these are people that have seen some really, really quite heavy stuff. Like they've been in Iraq and Afghanistan and you know, some of the stories that they shared were just really eye-opening, and you're like, yeah, I can understand how these people would be suffering from PTSD and why their, you know, the suicide rate is so high amongst these people. And that was really eye-opening, and it was just one of those completely random encounters, and Nigel and I both agree that that was one of the best days of our entire lap. Was the day that, well, it was actually 2 days, you know, the day that they rescued us and the day that we went out walking with them. It was just, you know, a random encounter. And I think that's the important thing when you're traveling, is to be open to these sort of encounters. You know, you could have been there on the beach and thought that this guy was creepy and said, no, you know, when he asked to sit and talk, you could have made an excuse and gone back to your room or whatever to get away from that guy. But no, you didn't. You were open and you encouraged that conversation. And look, it's, you know, one of your favorite stories from all of your travels. So yeah, you're right. People on the whole are kind. I think it was Jim Rohn that said, there's only 10 bad people in the world. They get around a bit, but, you know, and the point he was trying to make is that most people are good people. Most people are kind. And I think particularly with somewhere like Iraq, we have been so brainwashed in some ways by the media that, oh, they're bad people or whatever. People from certain countries are bad people. And while certain elements of the government might be bad, the same could be said for our countries. I think that the normal everyday person is a good person, and they just want to get on with their life, and they just want to be happy, and they just want to have pleasant interactions the same as we do. So I think it's important to be open to that.
Absolutely. I agree with you. I've definitely learned that lesson after visiting Iraq, and I kind of knew because I work with people who work there, so I was somewhat familiar already, and specifically, especially as an American, they had this was like the Kurdish people in the Kurdistan region of northern Iraq, but they had such a love and care for Americans. I was floored, absolutely floored, and so welcomed and felt so safe. And it was just not what I had. I mean, I had family members calling saying, please don't go, you know, because they are so afraid because they only know what the media has told them. And so I really understand what you're saying about that and agree. But going back to, for a minute, just thinking about loneliness and isolation and kind of how to connect, I think there's also sort of this question, and it's one that I honestly still struggle with to some degree, because there is this tension of wanting to see everywhere and also wanting to be with the people that I love. And it's really hard sometimes to know where the balance is, I guess. And I think it makes more sense probably as a couple. There might be a little more ease to that. It was definitely easier for me in some ways when I traveled with my best friend too, but it doesn't make me miss the people at home any less. I'm sure you don't miss your kids any less. But what are ways to balance that desire for exploration and adventure with the need for social connection and belonging?
I absolutely agree. And it's not just my kids. It's both Nigel and I have elderly parents now. And so that's kind of a constant thing that we are like, oh, you know, should we be spending more time with our parents because they don't have forever? So it definitely is a consideration, and it's something that we've kind of put into our plan as we continue exploring and as we continue traveling, is we need to kind of set aside funds and resources so that we can come back home, whether it be once a year or once every 6 months. And we have to be prepared that, okay, we may have to go home for an extended period should they get, you know, very sick or heaven forbid when they pass. So I think that it's always tricky, but I do think it's so much easier these days. When I first went overseas, I was away for 2.5 years before I came back to Australia, and we didn't have the internet then, and even making phone calls was incredibly expensive. And I probably only spoke to my parents half a dozen times. Now, for me as a 23, 24-year-old, you know, when you're that age, you're very self-centered, and I didn't really think then what it was like for my parents. I think about it now, of course, because as my kids are traveling and I want to speak to them all the time. So, yeah, I think we're very fortunate now that we do have the ability to stay more connected. And I think if you're young and you're traveling, call your parents once a week, jump on a FaceTime or whatever with them because they miss you.
Yeah.
Like, even if you're not young and your parents are elderly like mine, make that effort to stay connected. We're so lucky that we can now with technology the way it is. Finding that balance, yeah, it's tricky and it's something I think that Nigel and I have to talk about this a lot. And I was really lucky while he's been away this time. I said to him, would it be okay if I go to Brisbane and visit my son Nick? I haven't seen him for 6 months. He's been over in the United States doing summer camp. And he was like, yeah, go. So, I was able to go up there for a couple of weeks and spend some time with Nick. So that was really good. But I think it's just being aware and making the effort to make that contact.
Right. I think an important thing to acknowledge, I'm a silver lining person, so I'm always looking for the positive. But I think there's an acknowledgement of you're always going to live between the tension if you choose a life of travel. There will always be that, like when you're home. I actually cut my first trip short and came home a little early because I was just missing my people. And within 24 hours of being home, I was like, wow, I wish I was traveling again. And so it's just like, it's not necessarily the grass is always greener, but it's always like the longing for the other thing. And I think you just have to kind of learn to live in that constant state of having a bit of longing for something that you don't have right in that moment. That's definitely been helpful for me to learn to acknowledge that, to pay attention to it, to know when I need to be around. And I think I'm leaning more towards setting up my life in a way where I'm traveling about half the time, maybe a little more than half the time. And then I'm making time for being around where the different people in my life are. Part of that is because they're not all in the same place. I have people in San Antonio and people in Orlando, Florida, and people in Chicago. And so it's making my way around to make sure I get time with those people who mean the most to me and trying to get them out on the road with me when I can. That can be kind of tricky sometimes.
Van life will be really good for you then.
Yeah, I think it will, because then I could just take the van with me and
exactly. Yeah. Yep.
Go pop in to visit everyone.
That is a huge advantage of van life is it becomes your home. While we are traveling, we're still at home. So, and I think until you've actually done van life or, travel with your home, it's something that you don't really understand. When we do go away, when we go, for example, we've just been to New Zealand for Nigel's birthday and to see his mum, and we stay in a hotel there. That's kind of traveling for us, more so than what we do on the daily in the van. And it does have its, its different challenges. But having your home on wheels is definitely an advantage there.
Well, one last thing I would say to those listening who know someone who is traveling, I would say call them. I feel like when I started traveling, a lot of people seemed to think that I was off living this adventure and that I didn't need that phone call from them, or that they would be bothering me if they called, keeping me from something on my adventure. But when you're traveling full time, you're just living life somewhere else, and life is really pretty similar. You still eat your meals and you get up and you maybe go for a walk or do whatever you would do in normal life, with maybe a little bit more sightseeing or a few more hikes involved. But it's still life, and those people who are traveling may need you even more so than when they were at home. So I always encourage people to pick up the phone. Don't think you're interrupting. They would probably be so excited to hear from you. I know I feel that way.
Absolutely. I feel that way too. Yeah. Yep, definitely.
Well, Sue, this has been so much fun talking to you today. For those listening, be sure to tune in next week and let us know if you have any topics you'd like for us to cover in upcoming episodes. We would love for you to subscribe to join us. And as always, I can't wait to see where your dreams will take you.
Bye-bye.